Hello, everyone. I'm James Brown, Executive Director of the STEM Education Coalition. Welcome to today's webinar entitled Call to Action for Science Education, Building Opportunity for the Future. Thanks to everybody who's joining. We've got folks participating today from Capitol Hill, from federal agencies, from state and local governments, and from state legislatures, as well as many from the STEM education community. So welcome to you all, especially our educators joining in today. So today's topic is an important one for many in the STEM education community. You know, one of the things we were thinking about doing as we were hosting this to sort of make the point about the importance of science education and how it's being treated in the schools is many of you who are familiar with elementary education will sort of get this joke. But we thought about holding it on Friday afternoon at 4 o'clock. And then we realized that it wouldn't have any audience on Friday afternoon at 4 o'clock. So we decided instead we do it Wednesday at lunchtime. So with that, let me recognize the National Science Teaching Association as our co-host for today's event, and our co-sponsors, the Society for Women Engineers, the Association of Science Technology Centers, Universal Technical Institute, the American Society for Engineering Education, the Society for Hispanic Professional Engineers, and EDC. So with that, I will recognize our first speaker, who's Heidi Schweingruber, Director, Board on Science Education, the National Academies. Heidi, the floor is yours.
Thanks so much, James. It's wonderful to have this opportunity to talk about this report, which we're incredibly excited about and very grateful to the Carnegie Corporation of New York for supporting and really instigating. So actually have three of us who are involved in the work on this panel, myself, Jim, and Nancy. And so we're going to cover the report in sort of a tag team, and I wanted to give some broad framing and help you understand sort of how it came about and some of the main goals for the report. Carnegie actually approached the National Academies in November of 2020 to do this work, really recognizing we had this unique moment where we were recognizing nationally the importance of science and basic scientific literacy for participation in decision-making and solving some of the world's biggest problems, but also hearing conversations with the stress put on the education system about concerns about unfinished learning and worry that that might lead to a retrenchment to just looking at English language arts and math. And so really saying we can't simultaneously be recognizing the need for science literacy, but also not attending to it in a systematic way in K-12 and post-secondary education. So Carnegie came to us, and of course, the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine was extremely excited to do the work. We have a long history of work on science education, and this really built on, leveraged, and reinvigorated some of the work that we knew was already going on. So we were commissioned to do this call to really think about what do we know, think about what are the current challenges, and how can we give some direction, particularly to policy and decision makers at the national and state, and in some cases local levels, about how can they be part of a solution to giving more attention to science education and addressing issues related to science literacy. So we put together a broad committee that represented a whole range of expertise across K-12 and in post-secondary. And they were just an amazing group, many of whom started their careers deeply embedded in classrooms and schools, but then moved into policy and decision-making roles. So really understood all of those spaces and how you can create policy that encourages the kind of learning and teaching you want to see and removes barriers to making change in classrooms and schools. So some of the things I wanted to highlight about what's kind of new about this work, because folks who are in the science education and STEM education community have heard many conversations about the importance of STEM education for a while. Some things that are somewhat new here, again, are the focus on science in STEM, pulling that S in STEM and really giving it some emphasis. The notion that we're looking at science as being a fundamental literacy, like reading and writing and mathematics. And many of the STEM initiatives often have a very workforce orientation, getting kids into pathways, into careers. And this was really a framing around, actually, we now understand Everybody needs to be conversant with science and comfortable to make decisions in their own lives and in their communities on some of the big challenges our world's going to face. It also does prepare them for some of the more lucrative careers, and even those careers that we don't think of as STEM more and more are needing sort of some basic science knowledge, some basic technical knowledge. And finally, the committee was really concerned, and again, our current moment with the pandemic has really illustrated this, some of the entrenched differences in the kinds of communities and the opportunities they have, and some of those really difficult sort of lack of access, lack of opportunity, and equity issues that the committee was really concerned we were seeing sort of laid bare and wanted to address. And so those were sort of key issues that thread across the report and the recommendations. And the tagline that the committee would love for everyone to remember and act on is that we need better, more equitable science education. It needs to be a national priority. So that's kind of the stage setting. And then I'm going to hand it to my colleagues to give you more of the details about what are the specific recommendations and priority areas that the committee has called out that we'd love all of you to figure out how to respond to and act on.
Thank you so much, Heidi. So next up, we have Jim Short, Program Director for Leadership and Teaching to Advanced Learning at Carnegie Corporation. Jim, the floor is yours.
Thanks, James. So I just want to build a little bit on the past work that Heidi was talking about. The corporation has been involved in science education for decades, but more specifically, over the last decade, we've made some progress in a vision for science education, as well as getting policies to support science education around the country. As Heidi talked about, the Academy has been very involved working with us over the last decade. And one of those documents that started this work was the framework for K-12 science education that sets a vision for science. That's still the vision for science education around the country. And then the next generation science standards were built off of the vision in that framework. And just to give the progress we've made, 44 states have new science standards in the country. 20 of those plus Washington, D.C. adopted the next generation science standards, and another 24 states adopted standards aligned with the framework. And so that's over 70% of the students in the country are in schools and districts that have new science standards. And so part of that was the impetus for this report. How do we move that vision and move those standards into practice so that it's the experience that that students have in the classroom? Another part of this that Heidi touched on is the current climate we're in dealing with the pandemic and climate change and extreme weather. I don't think you wake up any day and not realize that science is important now more than ever. And we felt that we needed a study to help us understand, so how are we making progress on this? And so the report does focus on making an argument for why is science education important. And part of that is science is an essential tool for solving some of the greatest problems that we have in the world. We wouldn't be doing what we're doing today without science, because it got us a vaccination that helped open things up and get us back to some level of normalcy. Science is also in part important for a fully functional democracy. We need people to be science literate to be able to make decisions as citizens. And science isn't just for scientists and STEM professionals. There's habits of mind that are essential for everyone. And there are even fields in the workforce that use science education and the knowledge and skills that students develop in science pathways that are lucrative in other fields outside of science as well. So it's crucial for the future and in the pursuit of a living wage and good jobs for kids in the future. Heidi also mentioned that this report is about K-16 science education. And so some of you may be going, but wait, haven't we been doing that? We've been doing STEM for a while. And that's true, but often STEM science gets lost in STEM. And as Heidi said, many times STEM is more about workforce preparation and not so much about science literacy. So we're trying to really put a highlight on the S in STEM and what all students need to have access to. When you think about it, all students take science from kindergarten through 12th grade. There should be pathways for students that want to pursue STEM, but we also need to build that knowledge base for all students. So what's the vision of the future for science that the report lays out? And it's three main areas. One is around high quality teaching and learning. Another is about a well-prepared, diverse science teaching workforce. And the third is to have supportive pathways through science for students in K-16. So how are we doing on that vision? And so when we look at elementary science, we're not there. Students on average get 20 minutes of science a day, and that's not even in all districts, but that's an average, compared to 90 minutes of ELA instruction and 60 minutes of math instruction. So we don't have an equitable access to science education at the elementary level. How are we doing in terms of access to courses in the secondary level? In schools that have at least 80% of the students are Black, Latino, and Indigenous, only a third of those don't even offer biology, over 40% don't offer chemistry, and almost 60% don't offer physics. And so again, we don't have equitable science education in the country for all of our students. Students in high poverty elementary and middle schools are less likely than other students in more affluent schools to get like hands-on science, where kids actually get to do science, not just read about science and answer questions. And that's key to preparing kids for opportunities in STEM workforce. In undergraduate STEM education, lecture is still the predominant mode of how kids learn or are supposed to learn in those courses. And that's not how we know how kids learn from the research. In terms of the teaching workforce, students in science classrooms with the highest percentage of students of color and the highest percentage of students living in poverty are more likely to be taught by a teacher that's inexperienced and that many times doesn't even have the relevant background, the course degrees to be teaching science. We also see that teachers don't look like their students. 80% of teachers are white. Almost half of the students are white in K-12 education. In post-secondary, 76% of the faculty are white, where over half of the students in post-secondary are white. So we need a workforce that looks like our students, and that means we need to do better. And then the last thing I'll say is in terms of persistence of students that do get to college and pursue a STEM degree, we don't see equity there either, because it's much more likely that white students will be more persistent in getting those STEM degrees than Latino or Black students. And so I'm going to go back to the theme that Heidi left us with, is we want science education to become more equitable, a better, more equitable science education. Thank you.
Thank you, Jim. So next we have Nancy Hopkins Evans, Senior Director of State Partnerships and Instruction Partners in Pennsylvania. Nancy, the floor is yours.
Sure, thank you. So I want to continue talking about the report and what we found out and what we decided to focus on. So we told you where we are, and we want to get to better, more equitable science. So we have a great foundation to start with. And so we have some action areas for state and national policymakers. We had 3 action areas. The first one is to elevate the status of science education. I'll go into each one a little bit more, but I want to read all 3 first. The second is establish local and regional alliances for STEM opportunity, and then document progress towards better, more equitable science education. So we think that all 3 of these things working together will get us to the better, more equitable science education. I see somebody wants the report. I know someone has a copy of it that they can put on there in the chat. So the elevate the status of science education starts at the federal level. And we believe that the White House, with the leadership from the Office of Science, Technology, and Policy, should act to raise the profile of science education and elevate the importance of access to high quality science learning opportunities for all students K-16. The next thing we believe when it comes to about elevating the status of science is actually to the Congress to include science when they re-up the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, that they should include science as part of the academic achievement. Now, in this case, we're not just thinking about science state assessments or summative assessments. We're really thinking about accountability in a broad sense that helps to inform instruction, inform practices for improving teacher, their skills, So it's not simply about let's test the kids, but it's an accountability system that would improve instruction and teaching and learning across the board. So that's one of the other. We have two other recommendations, but I'd like to move to establish local and regional alliances for STEM opportunity. We realize that a lot of what we want to see around science is very local and is regionalized. So that although we do want that sort of elevate the status of science education to come from the feds and from our state policymakers, we do realize that many of these things are local and our educational system is very disparate and localized. And so what we want to do is to make sure we establish local and regional alliances for STEM opportunity. And we want to be able to ensure that these alliances are based on the needs within that context and that region. What we also have seen that's come out of this better and more equitable, when we think about equitable, we think about the times that kids are left behind and regions of our country are left behind. So while a state may look like they have a lot of resources, once you start going down and looking more deeply, you'll see that they have resources and access in pockets, but it's not equitable. So that's one of our big themes around establish local and regional alliances for STEM opportunities. And we have tons of alliances that are already in place, but our big thing is how can we make those alliances better and how can it improve equity so that we get more of it? So we're not at the point where we're saying we don't have any of these things. What we're saying is we need more of it and we need it to be more equitable. The last thing we talk about is the third action area is document progress towards better, more equitable science education. So we do know, as we said, we have things out there, but we need a way to map what is already happening and if it's happening in the right places for the students and the communities that need it most. So while we know it's important, we have a foundation that's very, very clear on what we're doing, and we have lots of things that are going on. We need a way to map it at the state level and then have this sort of reported out so people know the top of opportunities in their states and then their local communities. And we can ensure that if there are needs and if there are communities that are not getting what they need around the more and the equitable and better, that we have a way of measuring it and looking at it so that we can improve it.
Thank you so much. So our final speaker today is Pam Buffington, Director of Rural STEM Initiatives at Education Development Center. Pam?
Thank you. I'm going to share slides, and what I will be doing is really reinforcing some of the ideas that Heidi, Jim, and Nancy put forth. And I'll start with this idea of who has the most to gain from this renewed focus on science education. We all do. We know that we must invest in science education as it is critical to all of us. As indicated in the call to action, scientific thinking and understanding is essential for all people navigating the world, not just STEM professionals. That includes farmers and fishermen, welders, lay people, citizens, programmers, everyone. High quality science education develops critical skills, knowledge, and enduring practices for today, but also for the workforce of tomorrow. As was pointed out, we've spent a lot of focus on workforce, but these skills and practices provide access to economic opportunity and the ability to contribute to economic viability of the local communities as well as more broadly in the nation. And I'm going to specifically focus in a little bit on the rural community. Science education is particularly critical for rural schools and communities. We must invest in science education and educators across the board, and particularly in rural places. Rural schools face barriers in recruiting, hiring, and retaining STEM educators and science teachers in particular, and leaders contributing to the severe gap in access to high quality science education, further contributing to disparity in science preparedness. Science education and workforce preparedness is essential to the prosperity of rural communities in particular and the nation more broadly because in the wake of the pandemic as well as climate change. We know rural communities are disproportionately impacted by climate change and extreme weather events as they are highly dependent upon natural resources that are affected by climate change. Science education helps to support an understanding of these events, the types of remediation and other strategies as well. We know that we want to leverage the strong focus of equity across this full report. We must invest in science education and educators to develop a well-prepared and diverse science teaching workforce and make ongoing professional learning opportunities available to them. This includes investment in time, materials, resources to support high-quality science learning experiences. We need to provide targeted opportunities for these schools and communities with high percentages of underserved students and teachers. Students from low-income families, students of color, girls, and others who have inequitable opportunities to engage deeply in science. We need to provide opportunities there as well. The types of experiences we want to engage in really are those authentic connections to community and world, where we can build upon the natural wonder of students and have them really engage in ways that they understand how that connects to their own communities and the world around them. We need to focus in on the types of supports for both pre-service and in-service teachers that focus on student-centered pedagogy as well as culturally and linguistically responsive practice. What does this mean for teachers? It means that they have opportunities to hands-on engage in professional learning across their teaching lifetime, that they are not just prepared once, but continually engage in the ideas and the experiences of science. We also need to ensure that students are provided opportunities where they can see the connections of science across time. The pathways that were mentioned earlier need to be visible and accessible to all students, particularly once students are starting to really see those connections for future career and college. There need to be clear pathways and supports to make that happen. And as Nancy pointed out, they need to be equitable and there need to be more of them. So what we are trying to call out here is really how do we support those teachers to develop those high quality science experiences, as well as support students to really engage authentically within their world. So that's the big ideas I'd like to put forth, and I think we can talk more about many of them.
So thank you so much, Pam, and to the rest of our speakers. So we've gotten a couple of questions already, and I want to sort of key in on one of the first questions, which was when we look at careers and you look at and how people make choices about careers and what is and is not for me, one of the things you find in opinion polling and sort of public discourse on this is people will answer a question like, well, I'm not a math person, or I'm not a science person. When you ask them, what do you care about in school? I'm not a science person. I'm not a math person. And I think, to the points that were made about different populations we'd often think of as high need, like rural populations, for example, you make the point, Pam, about technician careers and things that people don't always think of as being so-called science careers, right? And that science is for me and not for me plays right into the notion that, well, I don't need to learn science because I'm not going to be a scientist, right? How much of the barrier we're facing here is one of public perception around this notion that science is important for all different aspects of life? Because, if you ask employers, they see skills on a spectrum where everybody in my company or everybody in my institution needs a certain amount of technical skills, whether I'm working in the science lab or whether I'm working in some other capacity in the country. How do we get at this question of, how much of this is the cultural barrier that we need better role models, we need better public, better public facing messages around this. How much of this equation is about that? So who would like to take that first?
Well, I can start. I'm currently working with two different high school teams engaged in a continuous improvement project around STEM learning. And in both cases, they're working really diligently to try to change the perception of students about what STEM is and what science is. I'm working with one coastal community in Maine where there are a number of fishermen and many different agricultural and other opportunities, yet students don't see those as STEM careers, and they don't see the opportunities to engage deeply in science as aligned with their future careers. And so being able to not only break down that perception with the broader public, but for students so that they see themselves in science, that we can connect deeply to the knowledge in the community, that scientific knowledge, that is so critical. And then as we do that, we will gain more connections and really embrace that knowledge from the community. In other words, have folks understand, the fishermen really understands deeply what's going on in the ecosystem in the bay and so on.
Anybody else want to jump in on this question?
I want to build on what Pam's talking about. So, I mean, again, I think this issue of students identifying themselves with science also links to the fact that in elementary school, kids aren't even getting science, and that's when that identity starts. So that's part of the issue. When by the time you get to secondary, you might not see yourself as science because you really haven't been studying science. And then the other piece is the vision for science that we have now is about kids taking natural phenomena, things that they experience in their everyday life, and trying to explain them, developing models, developing explanations, using evidence. And so it's not the science that many of us remember when we were in school. It's not definitions, it's not vocabulary, it's not memorization. It's really applying science knowledge to help explain things and solve problems. And so for teachers to be able to teach that way, which we're seeing more and more teachers around the country are excited about that vision, excited about the opportunity to teach science that way, but they shouldn't be required to have to develop everything themselves. The standards provide a great blueprint, but we need instructional materials, professional learning, aligned assessments. Teachers need the tools and resources and time in order to implement that vision of instruction.
Nancy or Heidi?
No, I absolutely agree with Jim. I was saying I'm sort of the both and type person, where I think there are some things around, as Jim pointed, that kids in the lower grades are not getting exposed to science. And a lot of times when they do get exposed, it's not relevant. So it's not related to their community, to the things that are happening in their life, right outside their door, in their backyard, or in a park near them. So that is one of them disconnects. I also think we do have an issue around like the fact that most people see scientists and would not assume I'm a scientist. I am. I'm a biochemist. They look at people and they already label folks based on what they're used to seeing. So we still do have some work to do around the perception of who scientists are, as well as how do you use science. There's the thinking, like we use evidence all the time. We're reading a paper or we pick out the main idea. That's looking for evidence to support what you're doing. We do math all the time. That's part of science. You know, we analyze things. We actually do experiments all the time. We're trying to grow plants and flowers. So there's a lot of things. It's just either the language and the communication and the PR that goes with it, as well as the fact that our kids in younger grades are just not getting really good exposure to science, especially science that helps them to figure out the world they live in, particularly the world that lives right outside their door and in their communities.
So one of the themes that everybody here has raised is the one of equity. And my question to the group is, how good's our scorecard for measuring that? How much do we know about what makes up a world-class science education program at a Thomas Jefferson High School or some other entity that people would hold up as an example? And how much do we know about the schools that don't have those resources? I'll just tell a brief anecdote. When we took a group to go visit Thomas Jefferson several years ago, I asked a question of the principal, do you have a wish list? And he said, yeah, I got it in a spreadsheet with links to buy everything. You want to see it? And the next day I had that spreadsheet, right? How well do we know what people need? Have we defined what people need? And what's our scorecard look like? And how do we get at that question?
I'll jump in. We actually know a lot about the things that we need to have a high quality science learning experience across even through K-16. But we also know we have a distribution problem. So there are some places like Thomas Jefferson, highly resourced, highly selective, where they have a lot of the things that we'd want to see in place in more places. And so part of the challenge this report is raising is how do we get those things to more people? So we identified some of them, the curriculum materials, the space, the time, the material, the materials beyond just the curriculum, the well-prepared teaching workforce. That includes time for professional learning that's job embedded for those teachers. It includes having a way to have more experienced teachers with deep content knowledge across a range of schools in a district. So we know a lot. What we don't know as much about, and one of the things this report calls to develop, are sort of where are the gaps? How do we track the gaps in opportunity? How do we understand sort of which schools or even districts are less resourced than others? What are the kinds of incentives that we need to introduce, for example, if we want to have teachers be moving to the schools, experienced teachers moving to schools that may traditionally have less experience. So that's where some of the work needs to happen, is how do we map the gaps and how to create a strategy to address them? And then how do we transparently track our progress? And that is one of the things the report is calling for, is for us all to work on that. We have at the Academies a couple of reports that lay out some of those ideas, but one of the things we're thinking about is doing some follow-on work with the community to try to make some progress on what would some of those indicators that map the gaps look like. We know kind of what we need. We don't necessarily know how to get that equally distributed.
Anyone else?
I just want to add, I think it's called out in the report, but it's really critical, and that's to provide, once we do have a sense of where those gaps are, as Heidi was saying, we need to provide targeted funding to schools and communities with high percentages of underserved students. We need to also establish partnerships and alliances with local businesses, local people, really to build upon and think more broadly about what resources can be brought to bear to support the inequitable access to these learning opportunities.
Jim, did you want to get in on this?
Well, I was just going to add to what both Pam and Heidi are saying. I started as a high school biology teacher a little over 30 years ago. And when I first started teaching, I was given a very well-designed set of inquiry-based biology materials. And I knew something about, I had a degree in science, biology, I'd taken education courses. But if you ask me how I learned to teach in an inquiry-based way, which was what we talked about, at that time, it was these high-quality instructional materials that helped me as a teacher. So when we even think about the fact that elementary teachers may be afraid of teaching science, they don't have a science background. Well, that's okay, and because I think we know how to develop high-quality educative instructional materials that can help teachers develop that content expertise. And not just have the content knowledge, but know how to specifically teach that content in engaging ways with kids. And so when I look back on my first years of teaching, I leaned a lot on using high quality materials. And I think today we've sometimes gone to the other end of the spectrum where we expect teachers to just create everything themselves. And so one of the movements that we see happening is third-party organizations like EdReport starting to review curriculum so we can see what's out there that is aligned with this vision of teaching and with the standards, and initiatives like Open SciEd that's putting out freely available materials. Everybody goes to the internet and looks for stuff. We know from studies that a lot of what teachers find isn't that good, and it's not aligned with what we're talking about and what instruction looks like. And so we need to have it be that the stuff that teachers find on the web that's freely available, some of that needs to be high quality stuff so that then districts can invest their dollars in professional learning, and really, like Heidi was saying, make it job embedded, make it part of what you do every day in your job, and have the professional learning actually focus on the curriculum they're teaching, so that teachers are collaborating with each other and working together. We've seen examples during the pandemic that when that core science curriculum or literacy or math curriculum is in place, teachers can collaborate better across in remote settings or in hybrid settings, which is something that we're having to get used to in education. So I just think we have to remember what are the kinds of resources that really we know work well to support teachers and really have big dividends for the student learning outcomes.
Anyone else? So let me ask a follow-up question on this front. So now you're a principal and you've got a budget. Let's just say, for the sake of argument, you've got a $1 budget, right? Not very much, right? But you could multiply that by billions if you needed to, right? But you've got a budget. What would you say the relative weight in the need for a high need school is between materials and stuff and facilities and buildings and consumables, all the physical stuff you can buy, versus skills of your teaching workforce, their training, their professional development, maybe the opportunity to take field trips or do things that are experiential, as opposed to, how would you break down that question of how much of this is a physical resource that we might call infrastructure, and how much of this is the sort of soft skill side with the teachers' backgrounds and their training and their comfort level? How would you address that question sort of from a priority standpoint?
And I'll just give you a quick answer, and then I suspect Jim has opinions too. When I first started the Academies, I worked on a report on high school science with a focus on, the laboratories. And we expanded that to be about learning. It came out in 2006. We had an architect who designs labs and is invested in getting districts to give them money to create the space. We pushed him on this question, and he said the teacher every time, right? That it is that professional learning, whatever. Now, I might add, given Jim's last question, quality curriculum materials also help because they actually can support the teacher learning if they're well developed. So that's my answer, which I found really compelling coming from a guy who wants districts to give him money to build facilities.
I'm going to just weigh in just one little bit, and then Jim, because I was going to answer like 75 cents, 25 cents. I think the investment in people and skills and ongoing professional learning is so critical, and but you need the materials as well. When I taught applied physics in high school, we were able to make do, but it would have been nice to have the real resources you need to bring to bear. There are great applied and real authentic ways that we could teach physics, but you do need some of those resources to make that happen. But definitely, I definitely lean on the skills and high quality teacher side too.
I mean, we know that the teacher makes the biggest difference for students. And so we have to start there. And I think the school leader has an incredible amount of influence because they set the tone, the environment, they give teachers the support they need to experiment and try new things. So that culture of the school community is critical. And then I think the curriculum is important, as Heidi and others have said. But the way I would answer the budget question is I would say, what are you spending on literacy and math? And you should be spending at least the same amount on science, because we have literacy and math coaches. We spend a lot of time thinking about learning acceleration and learning loss and all these things, thinking about what we hold ourselves accountable to in reading and writing and arithmetic. And this report is saying, as a country, science should be there on the same footing. And we've had, now a couple of decades of policies that pushed science to the margins in a lot of cases, sometimes off the edge of the table. And I think we've seen a lot of progress in terms of putting new policies in place, but we haven't seen all the support needed to put those policies into practice. And that's what this report is calling on federal, state, and local communities to think about.
Well,
Can I just make a quick comment too? I know I don't want to lose sight of also the post-secondary importance of high quality instruction, and that actually we underinvest in the professional learning around pedagogy for the post-secondary folks too, at all levels, adjunct, lecturers, faculty, tenured faculty track, two-year colleges, like that is really under-resourced there and underemphasized. And it's really critical because we actually have data now where it's pretty clear we have managed to get more kids and a more diverse set of kids interested in science and in STEM by the end of 12th grade. They quit once they get to post-secondary because the experience is not positive.
So now we're sort of at the point where we have to face the realities of public policy, right? If we're talking about putting science on par with math and reading, I think we all know, maybe we don't always say it out loud, but we know why that is, right? Math and reading are the prime elements of the required elements of the federal accountability system, right? They're tested more often. Science is tested once at each grade break under federal requirements. Some states go beyond that, but now let's now we're omnipotent and we can change that equation, to borrow a phrase from the past. What do we teach less of if we teach more science? Is that the way to look at it? How do we create the space for it? Is it we change the accountability system? Is it that we look at maybe informal pathways for teaching science that are out of school and that provide those options? Is it all the above? How do you get down to that real question of priorities? Because it's one thing to say, well, let's put science on par with math and reading. And certainly we as a coalition have pressed for that forever, that science should be right up there as a priority with math and reading. But to some extent, this is a zero-sum game, or is that wrong and it's not?
Well, I think at some level it is, and at some level it's not. So especially when we talk about elementary school and the lower grades, the thing is, how much time do you need to teach math and reading? It's an exorbitant amount of time. So you could cut that time down. You could actually teach science, and they actually could do some reading and math while they're learning the science in the young grade. So for me, it's not so much a zero-sum game in the sense that people have to rethink how they're thinking about allocating the time that teachers teach what they're teaching. So in the lower grades, that's more of an easier shift. Once we get to the grades, middle school and high school, they have separate classes. They have teachers who have to be certified. They usually have the time for them. It's the lower grades where they've just decided that you need 2 hours to do this and 90 minutes to do that. And science is like health and phys ed, and it's a special. So I think we could actually get past that easily in a lot of ways with some training. And as a thing we've indicated, professional learning for teachers. I've done lots of training with teachers, particularly elementary. And once you can get them to see how this is impacting their students' learning and their ability to think and reason and figure stuff out, they are 100% on board and would rather sometimes teach that than the reading and the math. But they need the professional learning to support them as they make those shifts. But I think it can be done, and it's not, if I could wave my magic wand, I don't think it's a magic wand that's needed. I just think there needs to be a conversation about reallocating time, particularly in the lower grades.
Others on this?
I was just going to mention, I think Nancy made the point earlier about evidence. If you look at those enduring practices that are critical for science and math and reading, and look at those and see how they map, they actually can be addressed together in science as literacy and really engaging with wonder and have students read and do math and so on. But you look for those ways of communicating mathematically using evidence, productive struggle, those things that really can then endure and build upon over time and allow them to have a lot more opportunities to do science later.
And the other thing you mentioned, James, were the other pathways and experiences that occur outside of school that need to be integrated and coherent with what's going on in school. And I think, where standards provide a nice blueprint for instruction, it's a blueprint that everyone can look at to see that how is what kids are learning in school being used and applied to learning that's happening outside of school. When it's 1,000 flowers blooming and everybody's got different directions they're going, it's not coherent and it's not integrated. And I think there is an opportunity in these regional alliances that the report brings out of how do we bring some of this vision together? How do we look at the standards and what kids need to know and be able to do, and then get on the same page so that all these experiences are actually aligned and moving toward the direction of the rigor of what kids need to do. In science, sometimes, we get so excited when kids get curious and excited and they start building things and doing projects and hands-on work. But that's part of it. But then we also have to make sure that they're getting the deep understanding and can explain some of the natural phenomena. I've been in professional learning sessions with new innovative curriculum, and many times the teachers don't know how to explain these natural phenomena. And that's fine, because if they experience the curriculum as a learner, they get to develop that understanding. Then they know what their kids are going to feel like, or what they're they're going to be thinking. And so we can raise the bar. We just need to provide teachers with the right tools and resources and time and professional learning to be able to do that. But it needs to be integrated both in school and out of school so that we're kind of all working together in the same direction.
James, I just want to highlight one piece about the, is it a zero-sum game? I think that one of the things the report's calling out when highlighting opportunity and equity and access is that we're actually making it a zero-sum game for some kids. There are actually some kids who go through the system and have fabulous science experiences all the way along. And some of what we're saying with really identifying opportunity gaps is, who are we locking out? Mm-hmm. And that we really need to understand how fundamental science is, and that we can't lock some kids out. And so your point about what's our indicator system, how are we going to know, I think is so critical. And it does link to this idea of, if 60% of schools that serve a particular kind of kids don't have physics, we've made it zero sum for them. So I think we really need to be honest with ourselves about that.
Well, and in that same sort of spirit, how much of this is driven by how we measure student success in the main, right? I mean, the challenge you have here is when you talk about putting math and reading, science on the same footing as math and reading in terms of the prominence and accountability. One of the things you hear is, well, it's very difficult to measure science learning with a bubble test, right? We need to have new mechanisms for measuring science learning. You need more open-ended type questions, and that raises questions about, well, how do you manage those assessments? Those are separate questions. But how much of this is actually driven by the fact that assessments also need to be evolving in ways that measure skills and learning and a more well-rounded education? In other words, is there a way we can short circuit the sort of the old school education reform debate about math and reading and how much testing, which kids you test, and what the measures are that are tied to those results, that were the battles that got fought around No Child Left Behind, and maybe you can leapfrog some of that with supporting some of the newer veins of assessments and the online opportunities that are out there to learn out inside and outside the classroom, and to your point, Jim, that's some of the metrics people are talking about in the informal world is, how do you gain credit for what kids are learning outside of the classroom too, right? How is that reflected? But I mean, how much is this is a matter of we need to be thinking beyond the, just testing. The word testing has its own, charged perception in education, right? I don't think we want our message to be, we need more testing, right?
Yes, right. And in fact, the report's really careful not to explicitly say, we're not talking about a one size fits all one test. We're talking about a system of assessment where you actually put together different ways of measuring at both student learning outcomes, but also opportunity to learn. So there's a balance of understanding how are kids doing and the progress they're making. The measures you use for understanding kids learning might not be exactly the same set of measures you'd use for knowing how a whole district is doing. And definitely, you need to include something about where did we have resources and where did we not, and things like that. So it's calling for a a system of assessment that, some folks have been calling for a while. And actually, I think some states are experimenting with a little bit more flexibility that they have on how to do accountability now.
So we've got time for, I think, one more question, and I want to have sort of a little bit of a forward look to this. And I'm gonna sort of draw a historical analogy, right? So the National Academies has from time to time really shaped the future of this field, right? I mean, so when I came to Washington, one of the first things I worked on was the America Competes Act, which was in many ways inspired by a National Academies report, The Rising Above the Gathering Storm, right? And what that report brought was this union of competitiveness, of workforce, and of education. What is the call to action for science bringing now that makes it novel and makes it timely, especially in this age that we're sort of emerging from the pandemic and looking towards the future? What's the big takeaway from this that's new from all these debates of the past about science and its place in society?
I'll jump in. I mean, some of these I laid out at the beginning. It's a perfect opportunity to do the wraparound, which is the notion that science is a basic fundamental literacy, just like math and ELA. So not just for pathways into the workforce, for participation in society, but also for a whole range of careers that we don't think of as STEM. So that's really different, sort of how fundamental it needs to be. Another one is the K-16, K-12 to post-secondary perspective. Even in this conversation, we've tended to break it up. And if we take this report seriously, we're really going to look at those pathways. And I love the phrase, we need to be inviting kids in instead of weeding them out. And so really thinking about what that looks like. And those transitions across K-12 and post-sec are so critical and such a place where we lose so many kids. And the report really calls that out. So I'd say those two are really different. And we've said things before about STEM for all, but I really think that this report has articulated that more clearly around the problems of opportunity and equity and the, the unequal distribution of opportunity. And I feel like this one has sharpened up some of that argument and the idea that we need to track those gaps. I don't think we've said it quite as clearly before, though. My colleagues may disagree with me. I don't know.
Well, when we first started talking to the Academy about the idea of this report, this isn't the first time this country's rallied to address a science issue. And one that many science people in science education refer to was Sputnik going up in 1957 and the wave of reform that happened afterwards. And the golden age of science education was for those 20 years after Sputnik, when the federal government and places made deep investments in science education to put a man on the moon, to get more engineers, mathematicians, scientists. But one of the things that's different, to go along with what Heidi's talking about, is that was mostly at the secondary and post-secondary and graduate level investments. And this to be more equitable and to give us the diversity that we need of thought, of kids' experiences, of solving all these wicked hard problems that we face as a country that only science is going to be able to address. We need science education to start at the lower grades and go all the way up through K-16 with a similar vision. So again, it's not the first time that we've addressed these kind of challenges, but I think, as I said earlier, I think now science is more important than ever. And we hope this report gives people some things to chew on to think about how to make science better and more equitable.
I would want to echo a lot of what has been said so far. And I think this juncture in time where science is on the front page of every newspaper and every media all the time in the last year and a half, and people have this heightened awareness of how important it is to understand data and evidence and science and the climate challenges that we're facing now and into the future. The extreme weather events, the things in our world in the last year and a half have made these messages all the more salient. It becomes so critical at every level. And when we think about investing in early elementary and in elementary schools, thinking about who's going to solve the problems, it's all of us. And it's especially critical that we have a prepared citizenry coming right from elementary up. And so I think it's a lot to do with where we are in the world at this moment in time. And I think this speaks to that issue so profoundly. And so I think it's just really important now.
So Nancy, you've got the last word.
Okay, so I've been thinking about this as everybody was talking, and I agree with all the things that Heidi and Jim and Pam that you said. I've also just thought about this whole idea of the difference in when we're talking about underserved communities and when we're talking about equity, is not simply myself as an African-American woman. It's not just race and ethnicity. It really is geography and where people are located. And it's very, very community oriented. And so it has to be not just it has to be a groundswell moving up from our communities. And we need the assistance and the support from the feds to actually make this happen. So I think in this case, it's very different because the focal point is not simply top down. It really is where the science and where the learning and where we as communities that are disparate and all over the country, that we need to come together and learn, but that the context is very different. So the solutions need to be appropriate for that.
So thank you so much for that. And let me just thank our audience and our sponsors and our co-host, the National Science Teaching Association, and our friends from the Academies and everybody who contributed to this report. Thank you very much. And the work is very much in front of us.